Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our daily Moravian text Bible study. It is Monday the 30th. I really hope that you are not just surviving, but as God's people, you are thriving in relationship with Him at this time of national crisis. Today's Moravian text reading is Matthew 27, 1 to 10. It is a tricky passage. It is a tragic passage. Judas hangs himself and ends his life. And the first thing I want to say about that is that I find it deeply reassuring that the Bible is, yes, it is a book of victory. It is a book that teaches us how to live in victory and thrive in life. But it's a book that doesn't shy away from the brokenness of life. It doesn't ignore the tragedy of life. There are stories in the Bible, like today's story, that honestly doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. It just reflects the brokenness and tragedy of the world around us. And I find that deeply reassuring. The Bible is not Disney. It's a book that expresses the whole breadth and depth of human emotion and experience, like in today's passage. The second thing I think is important to recognise in this passage is God's redemptive nature. God is redemptive, a God who always looks to turn bad situations into good, a God who is always there to forgive, a God who is always there to change things around. But it is conditional. It depends on us. If we turn to Him in our sin, if we turn to Him in our brokenness, if we turn to Him in that situation that feels outside of our control, then He steps in and turns it around. And so we see in Judas somebody who, well, he has remorse. He tries to make amends for what he's done wrong. He acknowledges his sin to the chief priests. But it's quite a contrasting story to Peter, for example. Peter weeps bitterly. Peter equally, he denies Jesus, whereas Judas betrays Jesus. But what is the difference? And could there have been redemption? Could there have been forgiveness for Judas? Well, personally, I think yes, of course there could have been, because God is utterly redemptive. And it's interesting when we think about Judas's sin, that he acknowledges it as sin to the priests, but not before God. You see, whenever we sin, when I sin in my words and my actions towards my wife, my sin is first and foremost directed towards God. So it's one thing to acknowledge my sin to her, that's important, but it's another thing entirely to acknowledge my sin to God and seek His forgiveness. I think it also reflects something that Judas believed or didn't believe that was different to Peter. You see, Peter goes back to that community of believers. Judas doesn't do that. I wonder what would have happened if Judas would have gone back to the disciples to acknowledge his sin before them, if he'd have stuck around long enough to see the resurrection as Jesus had prophesied. So is there a sin that Jesus can't forgive? Well, it reminds me of that often misused, misquoted verse of the unforgivable sin, the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. But when you read that verse in context, it's given to the Pharisees who are saying that Jesus cannot forgive sins. So if you think about it, logically, the only sin that Jesus can't forgive is the rejection of who He is and the rejection of His forgiving nature. That's the sin He can't forgive. And that's what we see with Judas. But even within all of that, God is still redemptive. He's redemptive in the immediate sense that that blood money is used to buy a field for the burial of foreigners. That is seen as a good thing within the passage, a redemptive thing. But ultimately, redemptive in the fact that God took that betrayal and used it to lead from the cross to the resurrection. It was necessary for the cross and the resurrection. Ultimately, something redemptive and good came out of it. What about you in your situation? What about you in isolation, in lockdown? How can you engage with God to experience his redemptive nature in this time? I would suggest, first and foremost, the way we can do that is an opportunity to redeem our time and use it as a way to develop intimacy with Jesus, to get into the Word, to get into worship, to get into prayer, to extend those times in order to turn them around and experience God's redemptive power at work within us.